We are live with SCI TV. I am Joshua Gordon, the founder of the Sports Conflict Institute. Today I have a very special guest, David Steele of Sporting News. Welcome, David.
Thanks for having me, Joshua. I'm glad to be here.
So by means of introduction, can you give a little background as to some of the areas that you focus on in your writing and how you got to be in your role you're in now at Sporting News?
Well, I'm pretty fortunate right now to be writing about the NFL for Sporting News. I've been doing that for the last couple of years, and for the better part of the decade before that, I was a columnist at several publications, including Sporting News, at AOL Fan House, as well as the San Francisco Chronicle, the Baltimore Sun, and I've had a chance, in doing that, to really touch on a lot of things away from the field. Not so much, hey, who's in contention, who should this quarterback get benched, should this coach get fired, but really dig into the issues that affect the players as individuals, how those issues intersect with the fans, with society, the sort of interactions between players and management, players and coaches. Again, bringing the public into it, and it's given me a lot of insight into where sports and where the athletes who play them fit into the larger aspects of society, and vice versa. And hopefully, it's given the readers a lot of insight into that as well. So it's been a real journey for me. I've seen my opinions and my outlook and my attitudes. A lot of these things shift a lot because you see more and more where these guys and these women are part of a bigger picture. It's not just a little narrow focused arena of sports where they're part of the entertainment. I mean, they're living, breathing members of American and international society. So it's been an interesting path I've taken. I've really enjoyed it.
Yeah, often I think it's tempting for folks to try and bifurcate and say that the things that happen away from the game don't really matter, impact the game or society at all. But I think a lot of what you're talking about is that they do intersect and they do matter. They matter for performance. They matter for the impact they have on everything from sponsorships to to fans to athletes themselves. The NFL has had a really interesting couple of years here. I'll use that word interesting loosely here.
Sure.
Maybe you could help scaffold some of the series of things that have brought this concept of locker room culture into the forefront for many folks, and certainly you've touched on it and brought some real great detail that I'm hoping you can share with us more today as well.
Yeah, I had an opportunity to actually look with a little bit of depth into locker room culture starting a couple of years ago, back when what seemed like the most riveting and polarizing issue the NFL had faced in a long time was sort of rearing its head, and this was the bullying incident down with the Miami Dolphins, with Richie Incognito and a lot of his teammates bullying Jonathan Martin, a guy you guys are familiar with out there on the West Coast, former native of the West Coast, the Pac-10 player. There were so many elements and so many layers to it that I just got the sense that the answers weren't that simple. Because I think the first question a lot of people asked, because of the nature of what was happening to Jonathan Martin in the locker room, was, they had some sort of standard of manhood that they didn't believe that he was living up to, and they were pretty much punishing him for it. And it was interesting because it was not that long after that Michael Sam came out and became sort of the most prominent football player to come out. But even before that, there was a lot of discussion about would an NFL locker room be open to a gay player. And it turned out that this wasn't necessarily the case in this instance, but those elements, what makes a man, what makes you tough, what makes you ready and willing and live up to the standards of playing a sport like NFL football, what really constituted that? What was that definition supposed to be made by a guy like Richie Incognito? Could it be defined by a guy like Jonathan Martin? Who had the final say on it? Was it the locker room? Was it the coaches? Was it the league itself? Was it the team? And it was interesting. It took me on a lot of different twists and turns. It turned out that the definitions really weren't that concrete. That there were a few underlying themes, but in general, I think what a lot of people the point a lot of people were making was that you had to have a certain mindset in order to survive in the NFL. And I think that was sort of the point that a lot of the players were making, and sort of illuminated yet another topic, which was just the physical and mental and psychological toll that playing football takes on you. And it can bring out the best in a lot of people and the best of their qualities, and it can bring out a lot of the worst. And I think what we saw in that situation and in a lot of the situations that have followed over the year that followed after that, that in a lot of cases it brought out the worst. And I think the NFL, the sport of football, and all the people who really worship football have been trying to wrap their arms around it ever since then. And I'm not sure if they've really wrapped around it very well so far.
Yeah, and so to what extent do you think that the demands of the game, and there's no doubt that the game itself between the lines is a very demanding game, and it's physically challenging, it's mentally challenging, and the pressures that exist are very real. But do you think those demands dictate the locker room culture is always going to be an issue, or do you think that that's an independent issue that's happening because of some sort of factors that create a locker room culture that most other workplaces would not have?
Well, I think in sports in general, there are always going to be issues of what sort of an environment is everybody going to work in, just because of the closeness of everybody, the way that everybody has to sort of count on each other, sort of teamwork and camaraderie that I think is essential and almost mandatory for success there, where it really might not be in most other workplaces. I mean, I look at my own. I mean, I'm a sports writer, and that at its essence is a very individualistic thing. There's not a lot of teamwork that takes place in doing what I've done over the last 25 or so years in this business. We have to count on each other for certain things, but never to the extent that teammates on an athletic team at all levels, starting with Pop Warner and Little League, really, the way they do there. I think when you layer on top of that what football does and what football demands of you, the physical pain that you have to endure, the mental anguish, the fear of the shortness of your career, and the ever-present worry that one hit or one blow could not only end that, but could really, worst case scenario, end your life. There is a certain level of quote unquote toughness that gets involved. I think where it becomes problematic is how far do you take that? Is there a dividing line there? Is there a point where you can't go past that and still call yourself a decent, normal, rational human being? And I think in a lot of cases, because of all those pressures, a lot of the athletes push themselves beyond that because of the importance, the way that they identify themselves because of the sport, and also because of the sort of financial security that sports provides for them. They could be set for life at the age of 27 or 28. So it's very convoluted, it's very complex, but the implications are really scary because we've seen, again, the worst case scenarios. We've seen the athletes who take their anger and their bitterness and their rage and their physical pain out on the women in their lives or out on their children, who take it out on their own teammates, who take it out either on the field or off the field, and they take it out on the game itself. It's almost like they have some sort of mindset that it's like a sort of payback to the sort of torture that the game itself brings. And once you have them all in the same place and all with that same mindset, you do have a culture that really doesn't exist in other workplaces.
So you've given a fair amount of thought to how to address some of these situations. You have some insight into ways that the locker room could be impacted to change that culture from having some of this behavior be acceptable to a very different kind of workplace.
Yeah, I think a lot of the pressures that constantly bear on these athletes. I mean, I think a lot of it has to be toned down. I mean, I don't think there's any doubt about it. And I don't know if there's a lot of motivation to tone it down because sports are so popular. They have such an exalted position in society, and there's a lot of money that can be made off of it and by the people who are in it. And a lot of people aren't going to want to give that up. I mean, if you say, if you say, don't put these guys through such a long season, don't tell them that they have to devote so much of their lives to the sport, don't demand that they put themselves in harm's way constantly, then the public is going to say, hey, that's not the sport that I'm used to. That's not the sport I love. This is not what I want to see. You see when they start to change the rules about hitting each other in the head and things like that, people say the game is going soft. Oh, they should play in skirts. Why don't they just turn it into flag football? I mean, the whole playing in skirts, we could probably devote an entire show based on that entire concept, the whole masculinity versus femininity thing. But, they believe that that's essential to how they play. And again, we're sort of focusing just on football because football has plays such a large role and has such a big part in our society right now. It's gone right past every other sport and almost like relatively in the blink of an eye. But I think that there has to be a way to rein that in. Somebody has to convince somebody with that kind of power to say it's not that important. We can't put this much emphasis on it because there's a toll that no longer is worth us paying, in people's lives and their mentalities and their mental states and their physical states, and in the sort of, adjustment in their lives that they have to make that once the sport is over, they can't carry over into the real world. You can't act the way that you're allowed to act within the team confines out there in the real world. I mean, that's the real world to them, but in the larger society, these things that they're allowed to do and that they're encouraged to do, it's unacceptable.
So stepping back to the Miami incident, what were some of the things that Miami did in the aftermath to try and reestablish a more positive culture? And let's analyze some of those. Were they good steps or were they less than productive?
Well, I think that the biggest thing they did was sort of what was expected. They got what they believed was the toxic element out of the locker room. They got Richie Incognito out of there. And by that, they sent a message saying, we're not going to allow that sort of a mindset in this locker room anymore. And then they really they developed a theme that really went from top to bottom, really from ownership down through management, through coaching staff, the training staff, and all the way down to the players, that they have to be together. There's no more of the cliques, the divisiveness, the factions that were being formed in that locker room. No more warring and feuding with each other. No more opposing philosophies of how they're supposed to interact with each other and how they're supposed to play. They're supposed to be one big unified group of 50 to 60 or 70 players, plus who knows however many members of the staff in the organization. And I think that they understood, the hard way, that they had strayed really far away from that they'd sort of let everybody be off on their own, and they'd sort of established their own rules and their own features. And says, no, we're going to establish a groundwork of understanding, respect, and team camaraderie for each other, not 1-on-1 or 5-on-5 or 10-on-1 or whatever it was before. And nobody's going to start turning their heads or closing their eyes to what's going on anymore. Everybody's going to keep the lines of communication and the lines of vision open again. And I think the funny thing is that it's instinct. Everybody just sort of judge the success of that on how much they won, and they basically had the same record post scandal as they did afterwards. And they said, well, maybe they need to break this unit up and get this guy out and fire the coach and get a new GM and things like that. But in the grand scheme of things, it really was a success in a lot of ways. That head coach, Joe Philbin, looked like he'd completely lost control of that locker room. And yet a year later, win or lose, make the playoffs or miss them, he had regained control and he had established something much more worthwhile. And I would have to say that for right now, he probably has not gotten enough credit for that, including from me. I probably should have given him more credit for that as the year went on. But I think he deserves it, and I think that organization deserves it as well. And it's probably a model that more teams, not just in the NFL, but other teams that are wrestling with this throughout other sports, should probably take a look at and see, hey, this would be worth it, even if it's at the cost of, winning games or making the playoffs, at least in the short term.
And so many of these stories that you've touched on, whether it's Michael Sam or even Riley Cooper or Ray Rice, Adrian Peterson, they exemplify what a diverse set of externals are coming into the locker room, right? In any sport, that probably very few workplaces have to encounter. Generally, workplaces are far more homogenous than a professional sports team's locker room. How do you create space for all those different challenges? And I guess it is a fair ancillary question. Should you create space for all of that, given the demands of the job?
Well, there's a lot of value to creating that kind of space and that sort of environment. I think what helps it along a lot is that they do have a pretty singular goal for the most part. I mean, everybody has their different motivations for playing this sport when they're on a particular team. I mean, guys will maybe playing for the next contract. They may be playing just to keep their job. They may be playing to keep their starting job or things like that. Or some of them really are like, if I don't win a championship before I retire, or if I don't make it to a playoff game, I feel like I'm a failure. But I think for the most part, if you look at most teams and most groups of players and coaches and whatnot, they do say, hey, we really do want to win, and the rest of that stuff will take care of itself one way or the other, even if they may end up trusting the wrong people who have different motivations for whatever reason. They will sort of collect on that. Not every workplace really has that, and not every workplace really has the sort of mindset, and this is not to say sports is perfect in this area, to embrace different cultures, races, ethnicities, backgrounds, genders. It's incredible how many places you go where everybody looks and sounds and talks and thinks the same. At say again in my business, in sports journalism, homogenous is a great word. There's probably too much of that. And when outside cultures do enter into it, the conflicts may not be as physical or as outward as what you saw with the Dolphins or with some of these other teams, but it's just as dangerous. And there really is no mechanism in place and no real unifying goal to guide those workplaces. So in a sense, it seems cliche to say that sports really does, have that sort of effect and can be that sort of a meritocracy that everybody sort of says it is. But in cases like this, it really can be, because guys will come together from vastly different backgrounds and say, hey, I'm a football player or a baseball player or a basketball player. I'm trying to win. I'm not going to go anywhere if I can't respect what this guy can do as a player and as a person. I need to learn how to live with this guy, or else, I could be out of this game and that could be it for me. So, there are pluses to just sort of the whole sports mindset and the mechanism that, in a way, can be ideal for this, even with all the drawbacks that have sort of come to the forefront these last couple of years.
Are there teams that you've seen that really are the models for how to create that kind of positive locker room culture that obviously builds a culture of winning, but does it in a way that doesn't run contrary to some of the ways that people bring in their own values and everything else into their athletic careers? Right?
Well, it's interesting because, I mean, what's difficult about it is that regardless of everything that we have just talked about just now, there's still this huge conflict between the players / employees and management, like ownership and coaches and GMs and things like that. That's a hard wall to break down, but it's not impossible. And if you look at, say, just this most recent Super Bowl, the Patriots and Seahawks are probably good examples of that, because even as players can come and go for understandable reasons, the contracts run out, they find another player, or they don't want to pay somebody or something like that, these guys really do care for each other, and they are very different people. I mean, you look at a guy like Russell Wilson and his background, and a guy like Marshawn Lynch and his background, and Richard Sherman and his background, and Cam Chancellor and his background, and and Pete Carroll and everything that he has seen and done in his football life. They've somehow come together enough to not only win a lot, but to want to stay together and succeed together, and to support each other and to have each other's backs, not only in front of the cameras, but behind the cameras. And that's a hard thing to find. The Spurs in basketball, same sort of thing. There's a core of guys who could really be very controlling or manipulative if they want, because they've achieved that status. The Tim Duncans and the Tony Parkers and Manu Ginobili's, who again among just those three, you couldn't find three more diverse backgrounds than them, and yet they bring everybody into the fold, into the center, the new players, the young players, the role players, and things like that. And they, over the course of a year, they coalesce somehow and continue to be a successful organization, that always contends for championships and never does anything to bring embarrassment on themselves or on the franchise or the city that they represent.
Yeah, I'm glad you highlighted those three. One of the things I know, I have some insight into the Spurs and then also the Seahawks. They do some things systemically that aren't just about bringing good people together and hoping it works out, but they really methodically examine character, culture, team values, and structures. I know the Seahawks have an individual they have on staff whose whole job is to be there as an ear and a resource for all the things that happen off the field, and to be able to confidentially work with those individuals to resolve those problems and make sure that they can focus on life on the field, and then also make sure life off the field is a success, and even to the point where after their careers are done, helping them get that next phase of the transition going in. And I don't think that's a universal experience across all the teams, so it's not a coincidence that you highlight some of those teams from my perspective.
Yeah, it's they were a lot of times you look at a lot of teams across the different sports that they're successful for a reason, and it goes beyond, hey, they just go out and get the best players. Now, of course, there's always a caveat, because up until last year, one of those teams that you would have mentioned as one that understands that and brings those sort of players and personalities together and has everybody with one sort of singular mindset would have been the Baltimore Ravens. And win or lose, whatever, no matter how successful they were this past season, they mishandled everything about the whole Ray Rice situation, and they have really been lamenting what happened for the last several months and saying, what did we miss? What did we not see? What did we overlook? What blind spot did we not get that everybody else seemed to see as all this was involved? It was unfolding, and we were putting our necks out the way that we were, and under the circumstances we were. So it's easier than you think to trip it up. That just sort of is a nice indication of how delicate the balance is when it comes to things like that. And just to mention Ray Rice specifically, and this has been said a million times during the course of this whole process, he was not a guy that showed the so-called obvious signs of doing what he did. He was a guy who was widely admired in this community, particularly for what he did for things like anti-bullying, recommendations, things like that. He was really embraced by everybody within and outside of the organization. And then he shows that side of himself, and realistically, nobody knew how to act. And it really ended up being such a divisive thing. And it's hard to say, even now, with how well the team played afterwards, can you really label it a successful season or a successful transition away from everything that happened? Because we saw, we saw the sausage being made in a lot of ways of how a team can really step over the line when the football side of it becomes paramount instead of the human being side of it.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, the behaviors that we see from the outside, it's very easy to have some clarity, but if you're one of the folks on the inside and part of that family structure, it's probably quite hard to reconcile, the Ray Rice they knew versus what you saw in the video, and that creates some disconnect, that creates some really bad decision making as well. So where do you expect, as we start to wrap up this conversation about locker room culture, where do you expect things are heading in terms of, are we going to see more and more? Is this going to become the new norm, that incidents of character issues and locker room culture are going to be part of our sports vernacular, or are we going to see some innovation around this and actually find ways to reconcile some of this a bit?
I think there are teams and people who want to make change and who want to alter the dynamic in such a way that things will start to turn toward the better instead of continuing down the path that they're on. But there's a lot of bad behavior that is being unlearned by the people who make these decisions and the people who make money off the decisions, and by obviously the public as well. They're there's a lot of pushback about that as well. And again, you see this across all the sports. I mean, this is I don't know if this is necessarily a tipping point that there's going to be nothing but change and evolution from now on, but things are certainly turned in that direction, and there's going to be a lot of upheaval between now and whatever time we reach a plateau of a different dynamic to the game, and the way that and the type of players that come and play, who plays, why they play, how they treat each other when they play, how they interact with the rest of society, and how they interact with each other. But right now, just like you hear that defensive players have to so-called relearn how to tackle somebody without hitting them in the head, I think that everyone has to rethink just that entire mindset that is so wedded to this is how things are in the locker room. That's just the way they are. There's nothing I can do about it. So I'll just go along with it and roll with the punches. I think that there's going to be a lot more changing from now on, and it's going to be a lot of resistance to that. So there's a chance things will get worse before they get better, but they have to do that in order to get better.
And David, as we go through all this, what should fans' role be in this whole tide and this change that's happening around a more inclusive locker room in order to perform better in sport?
I think they have to they have to let go of some of their old way of thinking. Like we said, we talked before about how you can't always say, hey, this sport is not as much fun anymore when guys aren't blowing each other up with helmet-to-helmet hits. You have to reteach yourself that it doesn't have to be barbarism or that sort of a mindset. They can actually come closer to what we believe a normalized society can be, and you don't have to make that dividing line and say, well, that's okay, that's how athletes are, that's okay, that's how football players are, let them go, leave them be, just as long as they win. I think maybe that's the phrase that everyone has to sort of weed out of their vocabulary. It doesn't matter as long as they win. These are things that, win or lose, I think they have to change in culture and in the environment of a locker room, because they're still people once they walk out of that locker room, and they're going to be interacting with you and I and everybody else. And those two mindsets, those two cultures, they don't mix well, and they have to start mixing better. And the closer they come to sharing the same values, then the better that will be.
Yeah, fantastic. And what are the ways people can follow you as they want to continue to hear your perspectives on whether it's locker room culture or a number of the other areas that you touch on in your writing and your talks?
You can always find me on Twitter at David_C_Steele. I'm also on Facebook. I have a professional journalism page that's tied to the sporting news, so you can look me up there. Remember, it's Steele with an E at the end. And I'm also at sportingnews.com, and we're covering everything right up and through the interminable NFL offseason leading up to when the games start in September. Believe it or not, the draft is coming. I mean, the Super Bowl seemed like it was yesterday, but it's on its way. So keep an eye out there.
Great, David. Thank you so much. We really appreciate your time and all that you do out there in the world.
I appreciate you having me on. Thanks very much.